I'll be running a series of 18 or so videos on homelessness, the types of housing, and the response to the housing crisis that we have in America. To understand how we got here, I am starting with this brief history of homelessness in America. When first used in the United States in the 1870s, the term homelessness was meant to describe itinerant tramps traveling across the country in search of work. Jobs were the primary need at the time. The primary emphasis was on the loss of character and a perceived emerging moral crisis that threatened long held ideas of home life rather than the lack of a permanent home. During the early 20th century, jobs rather than housing were viewed as a solution to the plight of transients wandering the country. The early 1980s marked the emergence of what is considered the modern era of homelessness. Major forces that changed the complexion of homelessness in the modern era include gentrification of the inner city, deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill during the Ronald Reagan's presidency, high unemployment rate, the emergence of HIV/AIDS, and inadequate study of affordable housing options, and deep budget cuts to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development and social service programs in response to what was then the country's worst recession since the Great Depression. In some cities, property values increased dramatically in the areas near downtown, and Skid Row areas disappeared as the rooming houses that were home to thousands of transients were razed and converted into apartments and condominiums. Since the 1980s, rents in metro areas across the country have been increasing while wages have stagnated. Deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill has roots in the civil rights and civil liberties movements of the 60s, which envisioned more fulfilling lives for those who had been languishing in understaffed psychiatric hospitals through new medications and robust community-based services. The number of patients living in state hospitals dropped from 535,000 in 1960 to 137,000 in 1980. California saw a dramatic reduction in state hospital beds from 37,000 in 1955 to just 2,500 in 1983. Funding for the needed housing and community-based services proved inadequate, and as cheap housing disappeared, vast numbers of previously institutionalized individuals with severe and persistent mental illness, or those who might have gone to institutions in earlier eras, drifted onto the streets and into temporary shelters. The recession of the 80s resulted in deep cuts to the HUD budget, which decreased from approximately $29 billion in 1976 to approximately $17 billion in 1990, and led directly to reductions in the budget authority for housing assistance from almost $19 billion in 76 to about $11 billion in 1990, and in subsidized housing for poor Americans. Two changes in policy particularly contributed to the rise in homelessness during that period. First, cuts in supplemental security income in the late 1980s, accompanied by a tightening of the disability eligibility process, adversely affected mentally ill persons living in rooming houses. The subsequent loss of personal income contributed to homelessness for many of these individuals. The Social Security Disability Benefits Reform Act of '84 was later enacted to pull back some of the aspects of the 1980 Social Security Act, which impeded the efforts of some individuals experiencing illness and homelessness to pursue benefits. Second, public inebriation was decriminalized in many cities, and those once jailed for public drunkenness now avoided arrest and often entered shelters or remained on the streets. The first federal legislation enacted to explicitly address homelessness was the 1977 Stewart-McKinney Homeless Assistance Act. In addition to defining homelessness, which is important for allocating federal resources, it also made provisions for using federal money to support shelters for persons experiencing homelessness. The McKinney Act also created a targeted health care for the homeless primary care funding stream with a distinct broad definition of homelessness, which now exists within the Federally Qualified Health Center or FQHC program. From my own personal involvement during 1982 and 1983 in response to federal legislation, the Coalition for the Hungry and Homeless of Brevard County was formed to address the needs of the increased number of homeless throughout the county for reasons listed above, primarily President Reagan's deinstitutionalization policies. Similar coalitions were formed throughout the United States. The mission of the Hungry and Homeless coalitions were to facilitate solutions to prevent and end hunger and homelessness by coordinating services. Many new shelter and feeding programs were then established and funded through the coalition at that time. During 1982 and 83, a clearinghouse of services was created in North and South Brevard counties to assist in the coordination of services for the growing homeless population. In 1985, cold night shelters were set up through Brevard County to meet the emergency needs of homeless during cold nights below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1989, Housing for Homeless was founded as a networking agency with the title the Coalition for Hungry and Homeless of Brevard County. Since then, the agency has acquired through lease, purchase, and renovation over 80 housing units for program participants. In 1997, the McKinney Act also authorized the creation of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is an independent executive branch body established to better coordinate homelessness programs across government agencies. The USICH, includes representative membership from all major federal agencies whose missions touches upon homelessness, including, among others, HHS, HUD, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The Council is charged with assessing the effectiveness of federal activities and programs for people experiencing homelessness, and to apprise state and local governments, public agencies, and private organizations about the availability of relevant federal programs and funding opportunities. In 2002, the USICH spearheaded the Chronic Homelessness Initiative, asking states and local jurisdictions to create 10-year plans to end chronic homelessness. Another change in federal policy occurred in 2003, bringing a focus on ending chronic homelessness through low threshold and permanent supportive housing programs. At that time, through a collaborative process overseen by USICH, the federal government formally defined chronic homelessness as an unaccompanied homeless individual with a disabling condition who has either been continuously homeless for a year or more, or who has had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. The next reauthorization of the McKinney-Vento Act, called the HEARTH Act, was signed into law in 2009. The reauthorization consolidated several existing programs for individuals experiencing homelessness, created a federal goal that individuals and families experiencing homelessness be permanently housed within 30 days, and codified the planning process used by communities to organize into continuums of care in order to apply for homeless assistance funding through HUD. New definitions of homeless, homeless person, and homeless individual were expanded. These changes were based on Congress identifying a lack of affordable housing and limited housing assistance programs, and an assertion that homelessness is an issue that affects every community. In 2010, under President Obama's administration, a federal strategic plan to end homelessness was released. The federal strategic plan established 4 key goals: prevent and end homelessness among veterans in 5 years, finish the job of ending chronic homelessness in 7 years, prevent and end homelessness for families, youth, and children in 10 years, and set a path to ending all types of homelessness. 2016, we introduced the Housing First policy in Brevard County to all programs serving the homeless. During that time, the Continuum of Care became the Brevard Homeless Coalition as a nonprofit agency, and the Housing for Homeless Agency became the first Housing First model for our chronically homeless program, and then all our rest of our programs within the continuum. Housing First is an approach that quickly and successfully connects individuals and families experiencing homelessness to permanent housing without preconditions and barriers to entry such as sobriety, treatment, or service participation requirements. We were able to reduce homeless at that time in Brevard County by 52%. But since the COVID pandemic, homelessness once again began to increase, primarily due to increased housing and rental costs. An unregulated housing market began to make housing unaffordable to low and lower middle income families. As a result, a new emphasis on housing case management has emerged. That's basically the history of homelessness up to date, and I look forward to having you participate in the following videos. The next one will be on homeless outreach. Thank you.